You've got to be willing to think differently and then to try new things. And then sometimes people are going to be upset. So I'm going to tell all of you young adults who are here and those of you who are on camera or those of you back in Kansas City, I just want you to know when you are trying something for God and you're going to do something that's maybe out of the ordinary, you're going to be criticized. You have a big dream, you're going to be criticized.
Welcome to Making Sense of Faith with Adam Hamilton. In this week's episode, Adam is coming to you from the New Room in Bristol, England. The New Room was actually the first building built by John Wesley for the fledgling Methodist movement. Adam had originally filmed this for one of his weekend sermons, but it had to be cut for time reasons, so he wanted to share it with you here. Here's Adam.
I wanted to bring you here to the New Room. This was Methodism's very first building. It was built in 1739. Just after Wesley began preaching on Hinnom Mount and other places around here. I want you to hear a little bit of the importance of this building and lessons we learn from being here at the New Room that still speak to us today about our faith and about who we are as Christians, United Methodist, and who we are as a church. So let's take a look inside the New Room in Bristol. So now we're inside the New Room in Bristol. So the New Room was built in 1739. So we were at Hinnom Mount and we heard how thousands of people began coming out. This is in April. Thousands of people, miners and others, coming out to hear the gospel and receive the gospel. And what they realized is they needed a space for these people to be able to meet. And not all of them would show up for, and by the way, Methodists weren't building churches because they were part of the Church of England. They were building preaching houses for people to come and be ministered to during the week in the evenings, not on Sunday morning. And so this was built as a preaching house and as a Methodist ministry space for all kinds of ministries. So 1739, April, Wesley's preaching to thousands, at Hinnom Mount and other places. And by June, they had the first building built here, June of 1739. And we've had a lot of buildings, a lot of building committees. We've never built a building that fast at Resurrection. But part of what this points to is buildings are important. We've always said that the church is not a building. The building is not why we exist, but buildings are important tools for ministry. And that's what this place was as well. So let me just tell you what happened in this space. So in the New Room, there was, of course, preaching. So you could gather in the evenings almost any night of the week and hear great preachers and people learning how to preach. So they were not only services for preaching, but they were also being taught how to preach. They were being taught. So in essence, it was a seminary connected with a preaching house. Can you imagine a seminary and a church being connected together? Oh, wait, we have St. Paul's School of Theology at Church of the Resurrection, Leawood location. But that started here in the New Room. Then there was a food pantry. So they were providing food every day out of this place for people who were hungry. Can you imagine that, a church having a food pantry? But of course, at Overland Park, we have a really significant food pantry there. And then they were providing pharmaceuticals. So when people were, they were too poor to be able to afford medicine. And so medicines were provided out of this place. This was Methodism's very first building in June of 1739. The foundry, which we'll see in London, well, we won't see it because it doesn't exist anymore, but we'll see where it was, and was built later in 1739, November of 1739. So this place was used, it was used for small groups to be able to meet. It was used for, it had all kinds of uses, but in essence, they were using this to say, let's do the work of the ministry and we need a place to make that happen. And that's how we look at all of our buildings at Resurrection as well. Now, I learned something today I hadn't known before as David Worthington was presenting. He heads up the United Methodist Church's emphasis on heritage and especially heritage sites. And he told us that when Wesley was here preaching in 1739, the bishop in this region, the Bishop of Bristol, said, I don't really care for you being here preaching. There are parish priests who are here, and yes, you're preaching to thousands of people who don't go to church anywhere, and they're miners and other people, but you know what? This is not your parish. And it was then that John Wesley issued his famous quote. He says, I look at all the world as my parish. Like, I'm a preacher of the gospel, and there are people who need it. And so I'm not going to be constrained by a building. And I know there's a parish priest somewhere around here, but unless he's going to come out and start preaching in the fields, I'm going to do it. And then he says this, and he was pretty bold here. Here's this, 36-year-old. He's your age, many of you in this room. He's a 35, 36-year-old young man, and he said, I feel called to be here in Bristol now for these people. And until I feel called to leave, I'm staying and doing what I'm doing. And what that reminded me of is the fact that anybody who's going to have an impact, is going to make a difference, you're going to break some rules along the way. Now, I'm not talking about breaking the law, and I'm not talking about being insubordinate or being, although that was a little insubordinate in that case with Wesley, but the thing is that many times people say, we've never done it that way before. And you know what? If you keep to that line, nothing amazing is ever going to happen. You've got to be willing to think differently and then to try new things. And then sometimes people are going to be upset. So I'm going to tell all of you young adults who are here and those of you who are on camera or those of you back in Kansas City, I just want you to know when you are trying something for God and you're going to do something that's maybe out of the ordinary, you're going to be criticized. You have a big dream, you're going to be criticized. That happened at Resurrection. We were criticized all the time when we began, sometimes still today. And when that happens, part of what you decide is, I'm going to just throw up my hands and give up because I'm being criticized. Or I really feel God is calling me, so I'm going to keep doing this, even if it might mean that people don't like me. And so, again, from Wesley, we're learning something that shaped who we are at Church of the Resurrection. We've tried to be respectful. We've tried to follow, we try to follow the rules. We try to be a team player and be a champion for the denomination. But there are some times where we just, we've felt like God is calling us to do this. And most of the time we convince people that it's okay to try it. But if all you ever did were things that nobody ever complained about, you're not going to do anything of significance, I think. And that's part of what we learned from Wesley as well. I want to mention two more things before we leave to go back to London. One is this is a little Methodist hymnal, and I have a dozen of these from the 1800s. In the 1700s, they look very similar. They were very tiny. There was no music in them. And you memorize the tunes, and so you memorize the tunes, and then you found yourself with the words, and many of the words were the words of Charles Wesley. So the Methodist revival happened in part not only because there was good preaching, but it happened in part because people sang. And John Wesley, or Charles Wesley, John's brother, wrote 6,000 hymns at least along his lifestyle. Throughout his life, he wrote 6,000 hymns. And those hymns, he was trying to put theology to music. And he wanted the theology to get into people's hearts. And so some of those hymns, but Love Divine, All Loves Excelling is one of those. Hark the Herald Angels Sing. There are many others. Oh, for 1,000 Tongues to Sing, and many more. And Charles ended up building a house just up the street from this preaching house. And I just wanted you to remember that. There's something to singing. And when we gather for worship, I know there are times at Resurrection where people walk in right before the sermon. So, and where I sit, I can see it. And I'm not complaining. If you need to come in right before the sermon, no worries. But I also want to say there's something, and by the way, when you're at home, I know many people who worship online or on TV, I want to encourage you to sing when we're singing. Join us in singing. We put the words on the screen so you could do that. Because there's something to singing that is praising and prayer and communion with God and learning theology all at the same time. And I just want to invite you to remember that. Vital faith and a rekindled heart includes singing praise to God. All right, here's the last thing I want to say is we've seen here that Methodists from the very beginning, we learned this in Oxford, we've seen it again here, the Methodists from the beginning integrated faith and action. That's just who we are. James says this, show me your faith without your actions, and I by my actions will show you my faith. Faith without works is dead. Methodists believe that, we champion that, and so we're constantly looking around at the community and saying, where's there a need? Where's there somebody hurting? How is it that we can be a part of the hands and feet of Jesus wherever we are to close the gap between the world as it's supposed to be and the world as it is? That started right here in 1739 in this space and continues at Resurrection and United Methodist churches around the world. But we also learn in this space that Wesley was not afraid to address difficult issues, to talk about difficult issues. So Bristol is it's a port city, and Bristol was one of the triangle of the slave trade. So British slave ships would go to Africa. They would take people, and they would sell them in the colonies, and the colonies would then buy British goods with the monies that they spent. In essence, it was a trading triangle where the money spent for slaves would be used for purchasing items in Great Britain. And so all of these slave traders, the ships were here in Bristol. And Wesley came out very strongly against slavery, along with a whole host of other things. We learned about prison reform and other things. Came out very strongly against slavery and preaching against slavery. And one of the last sermons he gave in this chapel was in 1787. So at this point, Wesley is 84 years old. It might have been 1788. 1788, he was 85 years old. And I want to read this to you. So the chapel was jam-packed with people to come here and preach. And they knew both of, as an older man, but he still had power when he was preaching. But they also knew that he was being more controversial when he was preaching against slavery. And again, they were saying of him, you're being political. You shouldn't be political. And he says, this isn't politics. This is morals and spirituality and faith. We have to speak out against this. This is injustice, and we've got to speak against it. Now, you're speaking in a town where there are many people made their living from the slave trade. Can you imagine how hard that was? So on this particular occasion, he wrote in his diary, while he was preaching this sermon against slavery, the people rushed upon each other with the utmost violence. They're sitting in the chairs you're sitting in, these benches over here. They rushed upon each other with the utmost violence. The benches were broken in pieces, and 9/10 of the congregation appeared to be struck with the same panic. I mean, they're at each other's throats, literally at each other's throats during the sermon, and he has to stop for a minute, and they're yelling and shouting and throwing things at each other, and he just lets it die down. And he says, in about 6 minutes, the storm ceased. So 6 minutes of violence and pews being broken, and the storm ceased almost as suddenly as it rose, and all being calm, I went on without the least interruption. It was the strangest incident of the kind I ever remember. Now, so far at Resurrection, whenever we've talked about difficult issues, I've never seen anybody trying to rip the chairs up and hit each other with them. But, we disagree sometimes. That congregation in this room disagreed about something really important, and yet Wesley was still willing to say, we may disagree about this, but there's a moral component here to slavery, and we need to be people who speak against it. In America, of course, the Methodist Church divided between the South and the North in 1844 over the issue of slavery, and whether it was okay for American Methodists to own slaves or not. And in the end, the North said no, and the South said yes, and of course, that finally came to a conclusion with a civil war in terms of owning slaves, but it wasn't until 1939 that the North and the South came back together in Kansas City, of all places, to form the Methodist Church, 1939. All right, so these are things that we learn from our Methodist heritage and from being in a place like this, and would to God that we would continue to be people who speak out, that we would continue to be a church that looks at our buildings as tools to be able to serve people, and looks at how we go into the community and try to bring healing in the community. Would to God that we would be people who continue to take risks and don't give up when people are complaining or criticizing, but instead persevere. And if we do that, God is going to continue to rekindle the flames of faith in our hearts and lives.
Thanks for tuning in to Making Sense of Faith with Adam Hamilton. Do you know someone wrestling with life's biggest questions? Share this episode with them, because the more people willing to embrace the hard questions, the better. Do you want to go deeper? You can visit makingsenseoffaith.com to find the show notes and additional resources. That's also where you can sign up to get the notes and resources delivered straight to your inbox. If you enjoyed this episode, hit subscribe and leave us a rating in your podcast player. That'll make sure that you get the latest episodes and help others find the podcast. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Hit that notification bell to catch future episodes and videos there. Until next time, remember that your questions matter. Doubts are normal, and making sense of faith is a lifelong journey. We'll see you on the next episode of Making Sense of Faith.